More than 1,000 days in 2025, we're still paying closer attention to the war in Ukraine. And of course, right after the fallout between Ukrainian President Zelensky and current US President Donald Trump, the fate of the country for Ukraine is standing at the crossroads. Now, based on the latest news, the Trump administration lifted its suspension of military aid and intelligence sharing for Ukraine, and Kyiv signaled that it was open to a 30-day ceasefire in the war with Russia. Now, most of us believe now the ball is totally in the court of Russia right now. How do we know whether Donald Trump will be the first person actually bring the peace between Russia and Ukraine at this moment? And also, what about the goals that Vladimir Putin is trying to accomplish? And most importantly, how about the European allies for the United States? At this moment, how can we understand the complication of the war? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Dr. Alexander Motyl. Dr. Motyl is a professor of political science. He is a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the USSR, and on nationalism, revolutions. And his new book, which is called Why Empires Reemerge, Imperial Collapse, and the Imperial Revival in Comparative Perspective. Well, Dr. Motyl, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thanks so much for having me, William.
Well, Dr. Motyl, I want to get started. Again, the whole world was very much in shock that as we saw what happened in the White House between Ukrainian President Zelensky and sitting U.S. President Donald Trump. Needless to say, now, as we start to catch up with the latest news, Ukrainians agreed to have this 30-day ceasefire. Now, right now, we're just waiting for the response from the Russian government. But meanwhile, for so long since the beginning of the war, we understand that Putin's goal were rather clear. And for example, he craved less hostile leaders in the West, people who would work to dismantle NATO and the European Union from within. Dr. Motyl, from your perspective, how do we understand the attitude from Donald Trump and also from the Ukrainian president at this moment? And do we believe, or how much do we believe, that Russia is able to work with the U.S. this time? What are your thoughts?
It's a good question, and it requires a complicated answer with lots of question marks. What we know about Trump is that he's capable of changing his mind in the course of uttering a single sentence. So remember 2 weeks ago, there was that disastrous meeting in the White House, and it looked like Ukrainian relations with Trump were pretty much at an end. They couldn't possibly get any worse. A few days later, in his State of the Union message, he actually spoke warmly of the letter he received from President Zelensky. So suddenly he changes his mind. Then, now that, everything seemed to be back to sort of normal, the United States suspends deliveries of arms and intelligence. And once again, it looks like everything is over. Relations between the United States and Ukraine couldn't possibly get any worse. And then 2-3 days later, the Ukrainians and the Americans meet in Saudi Arabia, and they agree to a ceasefire. And suddenly, the armaments are back on track. Intelligence is being offered. So within the space of 3 weeks, 2 weeks, America has essentially changed course 1, 2, 3, 4 times. So what we see today, is this stable? Is this permanent? Is the Trump administration determined to pursue the ceasefire? Is it actually dedicated to this ceasefire? Or does it see it as another step along the way of blackmailing Ukraine, possibly trying to blackmail Russia? We just don't know. The problem is that the Trump administration lacks credibility because it changes its mind so often. We simply don't know what it truly believes. We can guess, and some people say, well, the Trump is dedicated to peace. Other people say he's actually an ally of Putin. Some people actually say he's an ally of the Ukrainians. Any one of these interpretations is possible, but the bottom line is we simply don't know what's in his head or in the collective heads of his advisors. As to Ukraine, Ukraine's been interested in the ceasefire all along. So there was no need for the United States to suspend deliveries of weapons to get it to agree. It's just that Ukraine has always said you can't just have a ceasefire. You need to be concerned about some kind of security issues. Because the one thing that Ukrainians know extremely well is that Russia can't be trusted. And in that sense, you see, the Ukrainian attitude and increasingly the attitude of the world to both the United States and Russia is approaching identity. That is to say, you can't trust Trump and you certainly can't trust Putin. So how do you deal with this problem? The Ukrainians have agreed to the ceasefire, but they've also said that the ceasefire should be accompanied by additional talks, negotiations regarding the return of children, the exchange of prisoners of war. Now, the Ukrainians understand full well that Russia is likely to use the ceasefire to improve its military. But that's understandable. The Ukrainians will probably do the same. So no one has any illusions. But at this point in time, the ball is, as you said, in Russia's court. At what we know from the few responses made by Russian policymakers, and again, this isn't Putin per se, but it's people who are close to Putin, they don't seem enthusiastic about the ceasefire. They think that it advantages Ukraine, that it disadvantages Russia, and as a result, Russia presumably shouldn't agree to it. But this creates a problem for Putin, because on the one hand, this is now Trump's main goal, the ceasefire. And if Putin wants to remain on good terms with Trump, in principle, he's forced to agree to the ceasefire. But at the same time, there is something to the argument that the ceasefire, as it's currently constituted, would be advantageous to Ukraine because it would result in negotiations over the return of prisoners of war, the kidnapped children, and the like. But at the same time, there's no reason to think that it's necessarily bad for Russia. It's bad for Russia only in view of the fact that Russia's war aims go far beyond a ceasefire. We've discussed this many times in the past, but Putin is determined at most to conquer all of Ukraine, at the very least to take those territories that he claims as his. Those are 4 provinces. At this point in time, he occupies much territory in all 4, but not all 4. But he's already annexed them, so constitutionally, according to Russian law, they already are Russia. So it's not the Ukrainians, so it's not the Russians who are occupying Ukrainian territory, it's the Ukrainians who are occupying Russian territory, again, according to Russian logic. So he can't give up those territories. So for him to agree to a ceasefire is effectively to say, I'm not going to retake the territory that we claim as our own. That creates a real problem for Putin. So if he signs the deal, he's on good terms with Trump, but at the same time, he's effectively giving up Russian territory. If he doesn't sign the deal, he remains capable of retaking this territory or taking this territory, but at the same time, he worsens his relations with Trump. Ultimately, it all depends on what Trump wants. If Trump is really, really serious about some kind of peace, he needs to apply carrots and sticks to both sides. Thus far, he's applied sticks to Ukraine and carrots to Russia. He has to offer the Ukrainians more carrots, and he has to start using more sticks with respect to Russia. Because the Ukrainians are willing to go to the negotiating table. It's a question of getting Putin to agree to go to the negotiating table and agree to compromise to some kinds of concessions. And at this point in time, he's not willing to do that. Trump could force him. But it all depends on Trump, as I said, and we just don't know what Trump really, really wants. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Motyl, let's talk about the role of NATO and the European Union at this moment. I mean, again, Trump is a straight shooter. It's not a surprise to the international community. But again, we understand Trump's background. It's not a politician. It's the businessman. Now, one thing we do know that for Trump, it's all about the word deal. You know, you want to be fair, but of course that he run on this campaign and also run this political ideology is to make America great again. But Dr. Motyl, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, many times and during different occasions, the Trump berated the how unfair United States is being treated by NATO and the European unions. So in other words, he believed that everyone should pay the fair share if Ukraine continue to expect US to help and to support. So from your perspective, how do we dissect the such rhetoric from Trump? And also, do we believe that even though US resumed this intelligent report or also this military support to Ukraine, but right now the European Union and also NATO members actually shoulders much greater responsibilities to support Ukraine in order to win the war, and US perhaps at this moment it's time for Donald Trump to dial back to start to focus on domestic affairs, or even let's talk about this fair deal under Trump administration. What do you say to that?
Well, a lot of the discussion as it's been framed by Trump is just absurd. He's claimed, and his people have claimed, that he's provided Ukraine with $350 billion of assistance. That's just not true. I mean, there's all sorts of evidence by reputable institutions to suggest that the real number is somewhere between 100 and 150 billion. So less than half of the amount he claims. The other point is that a significant portion, about 90% of that money, doesn't go to Ukraine, but stays in the United States because it pays for the armaments Ukraine gets. So when you add up the real numbers, the amount of money that Ukraine has gotten from Russia, more or less directly, is probably in the range of about 50 billion, maybe 60. But that's significantly less than 150 billion. And it's, of course, all manner of magnitudes less than 350 billion. So Trump is using inflated figures. Where he gets these figures is unclear, but they're simply incorrect. At the same time, he keeps on insisting that the Europeans pay their fair share. He does have a point, in as much as there's been agreement in NATO, this was done several years ago, that all the countries should spend 2 or 2.5% of their GDP on defense. And most Europeans haven't done that. So yes, there's an argument to be said for the fact that they are getting a free ride. At the same time, the problem with Trump's approach is that he doesn't seem to understand that not everything is a deal. Because what the Europeans have provided the United States is trustworthy, loyal allies, good, trustworthy, and loyal trading partners. They've enhanced the security of Europe. They've enhanced the security of North America and hence of the United States. And these are things that don't have a price tag. And what Trump is doing with his tariffs and with his threats to leave NATO is disrupting these alliances, these relationships, which are very beneficial to the United States and arguably for the entire world. But in as much as they cost more for the Americans than for the Europeans, that immediately leads Trump to conclude that the Americans are getting short-shrifted but they're not. It's only in a purely business fashion that one would say that America isn't getting the better part of the deal. And the same is true of his attitude towards Ukraine. He keeps on saying, well, you don't have cards. What can you give me? Well, what Ukraine can give the United States is security against Russia, which is enormous, which is an enormous contribution to American security. But Trump just doesn't see things that way. His approach is, frankly, much more primitive. It's only a question of money for him. So if you spend more money than I do, then I'm winning. If I spend more money than you do, then you're winning. But that's just absurd. No one conducts foreign policy on that kind of basis.
Well, Dr. Motyl, let's talk about what we called the world order. Now, some believe that in order to end the war in Ukraine, first of all, we know it's not easy. It's not just as that Donald Trump can order Vladimir Putin and also Zelensky sit down at the same table to work out a deal. I mean, again, it takes effort and also diplomatic strategies. But meanwhile, some experts believe that by ending the war in Ukraine, we are basically looking at the reorder of the international cooperation. So again, Dr. Motyl, you're a historian and you study Russia, Ukraine, and also the triangle relationship among the members for so long. So how much do we believe that by using Trump's strategy or by implementing Trump's strategy, we are basically seeing the reshape of the international order? Or even I dare to ask the question, is there any Trump strategy to end the war in Ukraine at this moment? Or is there even a strategy to reshape the international order at the same time? Your thoughts?
I think the answer to both questions is essentially no. I don't think, and again, I'm being brutally honest here, I don't think Trump knows what he's doing in some strategic geopolitical sense. He's lashing out at countries. He's pursuing his own egotistical fantasies vis-a-vis Canada, vis-a-vis Greenland, vis-a-vis Denmark, vis-a-vis Mexico, vis-a-vis Panama, vis-a-vis the Europeans, the Ukrainians. Essentially, what he's managed to do over the last 5 weeks is create enemies out of allies, without necessarily getting allies any friends in the process. If this is a strategy, then it's a very stupid strategy, to be quite honest. So I prefer to be generous and say that there is no strategy here. He's simply responding viscerally to what he believes based on his lack of knowledge and his ignorance to be potential threats to the United States. The current war with Canada, trade war, is a good case in point. The Canadians are America's best friends. Relations have been perfect. There are no problems other than occasional trade issues. Why would you want to transform Canada into the 51st state? And Trump seriously believes this. He's not joking. He actually wants to do this. Do we really need Greenland? Do we need to transform Gaza into the Riviera owned by Trump hotels? All of this suggests that he's just improvising as he's going along. To the degree that he has any strategy, is simply, let's make a deal. And if the deal isn't what I like, well, then I'll pressure you until you finally make the deal. But it's a kind of ad hoc approach to international relations. And the same is true of his attitude towards Ukraine. We started our discussion with the fact that it's unclear what he believes. On one day, he thinks Zelensky is a dictator. On the day after, he thinks he's okay. Then he berates him. Then he thinks he's okay. Then he cuts off aid. Then he thinks he's okay. This suggests that he has no strategy as well, and that he's simply responding to a certain kind of knee-jerk America First sensibility. which isn't based on any kinds of strategic goals or some kind of geopolitical calculations, but is simply based on his own ego and his own ignorance. That's why Trump is so dangerous to the world and to America, because essentially what we have is a child that is prone to temper tantrums in the most powerful position in the world. And this child is capable of doing just about anything. It's possible that there could be great peace, but it's also possible that he could ignite a world war. We just don't know.
Dr. Motyl, I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about another aspect of Donald Trump. Now, recently, that I came across the article written by Max Boot. He is a very active columnist for the Washington Post. Now, recently, he penned an article which is entitled "The Most Startling U-Turn in the History of U.S. Foreign Policy." Now, the beginning of the paragraph, or the beginning of the writing that he pinpointed, and I quote, "President Donald Trump's affinity for Russian President Vladimir Putin is of long standing. Who can forget his reply in 2015 when asked about Putin's killing of journalists? And at least he's a leader, unlike what we have in this country," end quote. Now, Dr. Motyl, I know you and I, we had a multiple discussion before. 2025, how should we understand Donald Trump's affinity for Russian President Vladimir Putin? I'll keep in mind, now this war is getting exhausting for everyone. And of course, that right now, as we mentioned before, the ball is in the Russians' court. But meanwhile, shall we underestimate this affinity from Trump to Putin at this moment? And also, how do you think that this affinity could affect U.S. foreign policy, even just at this moment? What do you think of that?
Well, again, a very good question, Will. There's no doubt, Booth says, that there is this affinity. And it's a long-standing affinity. And if it's as solid as it may be, again, we don't know for sure how solid it is, but if it is solid, then it's certainly going to affect Trump's attitudes towards the negotiations, if and when they actually take place. It's hard to imagine that he will turn completely against Russia. And some people say that his threats of imposing new sanctions on Russia if it doesn't negotiate are just hollow threats, because he's made similar threats in the past but hasn't applied them. And instead of applying carrots and sticks to Russia, he's only applying carrots, no sticks. And that may be an indication of this affinity. Why this affinity? There are several possible answers. One of them is that Trump simply admires strong men. He likes people who are in charge. He thinks he's in charge. He wants to be that kind of person. He shares many of Putin's values. He's a reactionary in many respects. He's certainly not liberal. He may want to construct an authoritarian system. And in that particular sense, what Putin has done to Russia over the last 25 years is in some sense a model for Trump as well. So it could be that. It could be that he sees in Putin himself and wants to become more like Putin because that's the kind of person he admires. It's conceivable that there is a deeper strategy at work here, that he's concerned he wants to create some kind of rapprochement or détente between the United States and Russia so as to weaken the Russian connection with China. That's possible. Again, it suggests that he would need to have the capacity to think strategically, Trump. And if I've been right in what I said a few minutes ago, that he lacks such a capacity, then it's unlikely that he would be attempting to distract Russia or wean Russia off its connection with China. But it's possible. To my mind, it's unlikely, but it's possible. And then there's the last theory, which is the most conspiratorial, but not implausible. And that is that when Trump first visited Moscow in 1987, he was subjected to KGB surveillance, and it's quite possible that they acquired compromising materials on him. So some journalists have actually come out and said that Trump is an agent of the security services. Most people say that he simply was forced into some kind of subordinate relationship because the compromising materials are extremely embarrassing. Several former KGB agents who are now in the West have also said that, as has the former head of the Kazakhstan Secret Service. So it's plausible. Again, it would explain a lot because it would explain a lot in terms of his willingness to bend over backwards to make Putin feel good. But we don't know for sure. There is no document. All we have is circumstantial evidence. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence, but we don't have any definite proof that that's the case. So Trump remains a cipher, a mystery.
Since you talk about China, let's bring China into our conversation. Now, again, going back to the war in Ukraine, some experts believe that the US and China's role in supporting or even negotiating a ceasefire or a settlement will be vital. But we know that today we're living in the world that we're looking at the word it's reciprocity, or the universal question is, what is it in for me? So why do you think that at this moment, in order to reach a settlement or a ceasefire deal, what would China get in return? Because we know that China has been very vocal, but meanwhile, I dare to use the word ambiguous towards the attitude of the war in Ukraine. But meanwhile, right now, as we're seeing that this rough relationship between US and China and this diplomatic or political ties between China and Moscow at this moment, what do you think that China expect if China is willing to step into, to facilitate, or even to support a ceasefire or a settlement? Your final thoughts.
Well, there are several possibilities. One is that if China helps Trump or the three partners, the three parties, the US, the Russians, the Ukrainians, and of course the Europeans, if somehow or other China can insert itself into the negotiating process and facilitate an end to the war, that will, on the one hand, enhance China's diplomatic status. It will also make Russia more dependent on China, which would be good for the Chinese, not necessarily good for Russia. It would also make Ukraine more favorably disposed toward China. And of course, it might start building bridges of some kind between China and the United States. It could reduce tensions. But it all depends on whether the Chinese would be invited to take part in this process. At this point in time, that doesn't look very likely. But on the other hand, the Chinese are important. They are an important partner of the Russians. They are a dominant partner. And if in the next few weeks or months, something like a ceasefire is in place, and let's assume negotiations of some kind are started, then the Chinese could pressure Putin to make concessions or to agree to a deal in exchange for continued Chinese support. So the Chinese could play a very important role if they decide to play it. That's the big question. But they could play an important role in helping conclude this, and it would be a role that would be positively viewed by much of the world, and it would improve relations between China, Ukraine, Europe, and the United States, which would be a lot, and enhance Russia's subservient position vis-a-vis China, which would also be useful for the Chinese. But we'll see.
Of course, Dr. Motyl, at this moment, yes, I agree with you 100%. It would be great if China can chime in and help with the US in order to reach a settlement between Russia and Ukraine. But meanwhile, given the fact that we're also looking at this unpredictability of Donald Trump, and we still don't know how Russian government will respond. But again, as I mentioned over and over again, it's time for us to bring the war to the end, and it's time for us to re-understand the shape of the international order. Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, it's my great honor to speak to Dr. Alexander Motyl. Dr. Motyl is a professor of political science. He is a specialist on Russia, Ukraine, on nationalism, revolution, empires, and theory, and he's the author of 10 amazing books. Well, again, Dr. Motyl, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show for our future episodes, and hopefully next time, when we have the conversation, we will have some positive report or positive progress about the war in Ukraine. So, Dr. Motyl, thank you so much for doing this.